The gavel crashed down as Judge Harrington sentenced Malik, a deaf black teen, to life behind bars. His silence born from disability was twisted into guilt. The courtroom felt colder than stone, until one man stood. It was CIA Director Samuel King Malik's father. What happens when blind justice collides with unstoppable truth? If this moment moved you, please like and share this story. Now let's step inside the trial. I remember the morning by the color red. A boy in a red jacket crossed Maple and 3rd with a backpack swinging low, moving fast the way kids do when they're late for class. I'd learn his name later, Malik Johnson, 17, black deaf since birth. But what I saw first was a kid hugging the curb and a set of cruisers cutting across traffic lights, jittering against shop windows. The siren blipped once, sharp as a tap on glass. An officer leaned out and barked, "Stop!" The word jolted me. It didn't touch him. Malik kept walking head forward, shoulders tucked into the jacket like it could hide him from the morning. The cruisers nudged the crosswalk. Doors flew open. Boots hit pavement. Hands where I can see them. He turned, then confused, not defiant, and lifted both hands. Not up and out the way most folks do. He shaped his fingers. Quick curves, a crescent in the air, a point to his left, a brush at the jacket's chest. I didn't know what it meant. They didn't ask. The nearest officer stiffened, like he'd seen a signal, and lunged. Another grabbed Malik's elbow, a third swept behind his knees. The kid folded with a gasp. You could feel more than hear, cheek to concrete, palms open, fingers still trying to say something to no one who would listen. Phones came out. Someone muttered gang sign. Another said, "He won't even talk." I stepped closer than I should have and saw his eyes startled, scared, searching. He tried to form more shapes and a wrist was wrenched up behind him. Metal cuffs clicked. An officer read a script at a volume that suggested the boy was stubborn, not deaf. Cars honked. A bus hissed. The world kept moving, like it does whenever the wrong person is in the middle of the street. A block away, a corner store had been robbed 10 minutes earlier. The clerk told police the suspect wore a red jacket and ran east. Malik wore a red jacket because his friend had lent it to him when the air snapped cold. He was heading to a vocational class at the community center on 5th. That's what we learned later. In the moment, all I saw was a color, a match, and the speed with which a match becomes a verdict. By noon, a local blog splashed a headline, "Deaf Teen Silent in Face of Robbery Accusation." The quotes did all the heavy lifting. They made silence sound like a choice. A talk radio host said, "If you've got nothing to hide, you answer questions." On TV, a panel nodded about youth gangs' refusal to cooperate these kids today. No one mentioned American Sign Language. No one asked what a siren and shouted orders sound like to someone who can't hear. At the precinct, I saw a woman at the edge of the lobby clutching a zippered Bible and a wrinkled form letter. She had Malik's jawline and his tired, stubborn eyes. Her name was Layla, his aunt, the one who'd raised him. She told anyone within arm's reach. He was going to class. When a friend wrapped her in a hug, Layla whispered the kind of sentence that makes you turn your head. If only the woman who helped him once were still here. She didn't say a name. She said it like a prayer you keep small so it doesn't break. Things moved faster than made sense. That afternoon, a case file left the precinct and landed on the desk of Assistant District Attorney Travis Rudd. The way we heard it later, through a forwarded email that buzzed around like a gnat, Rudd clicked open the calendar for the court's interpreter pool, typed 6 words that might as well have been a door closing. ASL interpreter. Unavailable, proceed as scheduled, and press send. No request to reschedule. No notation about a deaf defendant. Docket efficiency, they call it, as if time saved were the same as justice done. I took a seat in the last row of Department 12 the next morning because I couldn't shake the red jacket or the way the cuffs had looked too big for a kid that age. The courtroom smelled like old wood and cold coffee. Sun hit the dust in the air and made it look like the snow that never lands. Bailiffs moved like furniture, rearranging itself. The clerk shuffled papers in a stack that seemed to be all the evidence the day needed. They brought Malik in from the side door. The chain on his wrist flashed once, then settled against the dark fabric of county blues. Without the jacket, he seemed smaller, as if color itself had been a kind of shield. He sat when they told him to sit and stared at the table with the intensity of someone reading lips that weren't moving. When the bailiff said his name, he startled, then steadied, then lifted his hands a few inches, reflex instinct. Language reaching for air. The deputy at his elbow pressed those hands flat to the table and said, "None of that." "Counsel," the clerk called. Elena Morales rose at the defense table. She looked like she'd slept in a chair. She leaned toward Malik and exaggerated the shape of her mouth. "You okay?" Because that's what people do when they don't know the sign. They try to turn English into a picture. He nodded, not because he understood, I think, but because nodding buys you a second to breathe. Across the aisle, Travis Rudd adjusted his tie and didn't bother to look at them. "I kept expecting to hear interpreters on the way you expect a fire alarm to quit after it proves its point." No one said it. The clock ticked, shoes scuffed. Somewhere down the hall, a copier coughed. The only language in the room was procedure. A bailiff leaned toward Malik again when he shifted in his seat. The kid lifted his hands a little higher this time. Crescent, left, jacket. The movement was slower now, deliberate, a plea taught in motions. The deputy's palms swept over Malik's knuckles and pinned them gently, almost kindly, and it was somehow worse than force. He said, "Just answer yes or no. It would have been funny if it hadn't been a boy's life." When Layla slipped into the pew beside me, she smelled like the same cheap hand soap they keep by courthouse sinks. She kept standing, a little sitting, a little craning to see his face. "He reads eyes," she whispered. "He's good at that. Reads eyes better than lips." She pulled the wrinkled letter from her purse, the one she tried to show at the precinct, and tucked it back without unfolding it, as if paper could be a promise you keep safe until someone asks. The judge wasn't on the bench yet, but you could feel the bench in the room, the way you feel a storm before it breaks. The seal over the wood gleamed. The flag leaned forward, already listening. Rudd paged through nothing, like he was searching for a reason to be bored. Elena tapped a pen against her pad and stopped herself, pulled in a breath, tried again. In the space between those small sounds, Malik stared at the door he'd come through, as if staring could make it open the other way. "You might think a courtroom is where you finally get to speak. I thought that once. Sitting there watching a boy's language flattened under a stranger's hand, I learned there are rooms where silence isn't absence at all. It's a verdict rehearsed." The side door clicked it again. A bailiff said, "All rise," and the room found its feet on habit. The judge's robe darkened the doorway like a shadow stepping into its owner. Malik flinched at the movement, lifted his fingers a fraction, and the deputy's hands settled on them for a second time. That is how it began. A red jacket traded for county blue, a siren that never reached the right ears, a pair of hands that kept trying to speak, in a courtroom that hadn't planned on hearing. I was in the back row when the room rose as one, and Judge Harriet Vale took the bench. The sound wasn't loud, just chairs sliding, shoes shifting, but it felt like a tide pulling us to our feet. The seal over her head gleamed. The clerk called the case. The air tightened. Assistant District Attorney Travis Rudd stood first, buttoning his jacket like he'd been practicing for a mirror. "Your Honor," he said, voice smooth as a hallway floor. "The defendant's silence is evidence. He cannot justify his conduct." He didn't look at Malik when he said it. He looked at the judge, at the transcript, at the finish line. Elena Morales rose at the defense table before the echo of his words died. "Your Honor, we need an ASL interpreter. My client is deaf. Proceeding without one violates his basic right to understand and be understood. I'm asking for a continuance." Judge Vale didn't sigh. She didn't shift. She simply tipped her chin. "Counsel, the court cannot delay further. The calendar is full. We are here for sentencing. It's not a delay for the sake of delay," Elena pressed. "It's access. There are issues with the record, Ms. Morales," the judge cut in voice. "Even you had the opportunity to raise those issues before. We are past that point." Across the aisle, Rudd clasped his hands like a man at prayer. "The people are ready, Your Honor." I looked at Malik. He sat very still, eyes moving from mouth to mouth, like he was trying to build a sentence out of scraps. His fingertips flexed against the table. You could see the moment instinct outran caution. He lifted his hands to shape a thought. Crescent, left, jacket. A deputy's palm settled over his knuckles. Not rough, just final. "None of that," the deputy murmured. Elena angled her body so her face was in Malik's line of sight and overpronounced, "I'm with you." He nodded like a person nods when the world narrows to one friendly shape. Rudd began again, this time with a cadence that struck each word like a nail. "We have a clerk who described a red jacket, a suspect running east, and a defendant who upon lawful command refused to cooperate, offered no explanation, and used hand signals consistent with gang activity. He paused exactly long enough to let gang do its work in the room. The community needs closure. The victim needs certainty. The court should impose the maximum. Elena's voice thinned but did not shake. What the people call refusal is the simple fact of deafness. What they call gang signals is my client's language. What they call closure is speed at the expense of accuracy. If there is any courtroom where those distinctions matter, it is this one. Judge Vale looked down, then up. The record reflects counsel's position. It also reflects the verdict. Proceed. There was a hush that had weight to it. Papers settled. Someone coughed into a sleeve. Layla slid into an empty spot 2 pews ahead of me, her purse clutched to her chest. I could see the corner of a letter folded and refolded on itself until it had its own memory of being held. She didn't look around. She looked at Malik and only Malik. Elena tried one last time. Your Honor, even at sentencing, fundamental fairness applies. The court can and should ensure an interpreter is present before any ruling. 30 minutes, an hour, whatever it takes. The court cannot delay further, Judge Vale repeated, and this time the words closed like a door. Malik's throat worked. He drew in air like a swimmer trying to break the surface and forced out a sound, the kind of raw, broken note that a body makes when it's learned to live without noise. Heads turned. You could watch it happen, the reflexive flinch, the quick calculation that converted a human sound into a threat. A woman in the gallery pulled her coat tighter. A man near the wall folded his arms. The deputy's hand pressed Malik's fingers flat again. Rudd didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He read from a page that might as well have been a script. Your Honor, the people request life in state prison. The defendant has shown no remorse, offered no explanation, and continues to defy lawful authority. Elena leaned in, both palms open. He cannot show what you refuse to see, she said, not to the prosecutor, not even to the judge, but to the idea that language had to come in the shape of sound to count. Judge Vale straightened. Mr. Johnson, please stand. Malik rose with the help of the deputy. The chain between his wrists chimed once, then stilled. He fixed his eyes on the judge's mouth, reading, guessing, reaching. This court, she said, having reviewed the record and considered the arguments, imposes a sentence of life in prison. No flourish, no sermon, just the fact of it laid down like stone. For a second, no one moved. You could hear the lights. Then Layla made a sound that refused to be a whisper. She shot to her feet as if pulled by a string, the letter half out of her bag. He was in class, she said, words tumbling, hands trembling. He was in class. A bailiff took one step toward her and stopped when her voice broke into tears. She pressed the paper to her heart like it could hold anything back. Elena closed her eyes, then opened them. For the record, she said hoarsely, the defense renews its objection to proceeding without an interpreter and notes newly discovered evidence of alibi. Noted, Judge Vale replied, already turning to the clerk. Remand to state custody, next matter. That's when the gavel fell. Not hard, not theatrical. A single strike, exact as a period. It didn't sound like wood on wood. It sounded like a door locking 2 rooms away. Malik swayed, then steadied. He turned his head toward the row where Layla stood, toward the shape of her crying, and lifted his hands a few inches before memory brought them back down. Elena whispered something that looked like, hold on, and he nodded because nodding is the one answer they still let him keep. The deputy touched Malik's elbow. Procedure clicked, forward paperwork signatures, the slow choreography of custody. In the gallery, a rustle of coats suggested winter had come early to the room. Rudd stacked his files into a neat, perfect pile. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The system had spoken in the only language it trusted. On the way out, Layla sank onto the bench like a person who'd been running while sitting still. She unfolded the letter, one crease, then another, and then folded it back again, without reading. He was in class, she said, to the wood, to the air, to anyone who might pick up a syllable and carry it where it needed to go. From the back row, I watched the door Malik had entered swing open again to take him the other way. The room hummed with the ordinary sounds of court names, called dates, set lives scheduled. I thought of the red jacket the way a siren can be as useless as a lullaby. If it can't find your ears, the way a hand on another hand can be the softest kind of muzzle. People say silence is empty. In Department 12 that morning, silence was full. It held a boy's language, a woman's letter, a lawyer's unfinished argument. It held a sentence that would not fit in a paragraph. And it held the echo of a gavel that promised without apology that nothing would slow down for the sake of a single child learning to speak with his hands. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the projector flickered to life. Everyone leaned forward as though the truth itself might finally be revealed in the glow of that grainy footage. Elena Morales, her jaw tight but her voice steady, addressed the judge. Your Honor, I request permission to present traffic camera footage taken from the intersection where Malik was stopped. Judge Vale gave a curt nod. The screen filled with the shaky view of a busy crosswalk, cars rolling past people moving in hurried lines. And there he was, Malik Johnson, a slim black teenager in a red jacket, walking with that quiet determination only someone trying to mind their own business could carry. The video paused at the crucial moment. Elena pointed. Notice his hand, she said. The screen showed Malik lifting one hand, curling his fingers into the shape of a crescent, then pointing left before tapping his own jacket. The room held its breath. Rudd, the prosecutor, seized the moment. His voice was sharp, commanding. That, Your Honor, is exactly what officers recorded in their report. A gang signal, a call to coordinate a warning to his accomplices. It's all right there. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably, some nodding, faintly as if they had already seen this story 100 times before. But Elena didn't back down. She stepped closer to the screen, her dark eyes fixed on Malik's frozen image. No, that movement? It isn't a gang sign, it's description. Malik was born deaf. He uses his hands to communicate what he cannot say. What you're seeing is not code, it's his language. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. A man in the back shook his head, whispering to the woman beside him. The judge raised a hand for silence, but curiosity had already been stirred. Elena pressed on. Look again. Crescent moon, he's describing shape. Pointing left direction, tapping the coat color. He wasn't sending signals to a gang. He was describing what he saw, the red jacket, the same jacket he happened to be wearing himself. This is a boy trying to make sense of the world the only way he knows how. The screen froze on Malik's face, eyes wide, lips pressed, shut, the innocence of someone misunderstood by the world around him. Rudd scoffed. That's conjecture. We don't have a certified interpreter telling us that. What we do have are officers trained in gang activity, and they recognized it instantly. Elena turned sharply, her voice rising with conviction. Trained to see what they already believed, Mr. Rudd. They were looking for a criminal, and so that's all they saw. For a moment, the room went utterly silent. Even Judge Vale hesitated, her gavel resting motionless. From the gallery, Layla's hands trembled in her lap. She remembered Malik as a little boy sitting at the kitchen table sketching shapes in the air with those very same gestures. A circle for the sun, 2 fingers fluttering for birds, a crescent for the moon. He had been painting the world with his hands since the day she took him in. Her breath caught, and she whispered almost to herself, "That's just Malik talking." The juror closest to her glanced over, catching the words. On the screen, the footage looped once more. Malik's silent hands moved like fragments of poetry misunderstood and twisted into something ugly by men unwilling to look deeper. The prosecutor crossed his arms, lips pressed thin. Elena folded her own arms too, but her eyes softened as she looked at Malik, still sitting in that defendant's chair, shoulders hunched but gaze steady. For the first time in hours, the balance inside that courtroom shifted. A seed of doubt had been planted not in Malik, but in the story that had been forced upon him. The heavy courtroom doors swung shut behind Elena as she stepped into the hallway. The tension inside still clung to her shoulders, but out here the air was cooler, carrying the hushed buzz of people waiting, whispering, wondering what would happen next. Among the scattered faces leaning against the walls, one man stood out, not because he was loud, but because of the way he was watching the world. His eyes followed every movement, sharp and thoughtful, as though he was listening without ears. Elena Morales, he asked softly. She turned cautious. Yes, the man offered a hand. Jonah Lee, I'm an ASL interpreter. I couldn't help but notice the footage you played. I think I can help. Something in his tone, steady, certain, made her pause. For hours, she had been clawing against walls built of prejudice and indifference. This man sounded like he carried a key. They stepped aside to a quiet corner of the corridor. Jonah leaned closer, lowering his voice as if sharing something sacred. I grew up with parents who were both deaf, he explained. By the time I was 7, I was their voice in hospitals and grocery stores, even during arguments with neighbors. I know what silence looks like when it tries to speak. And I know what your client was saying. Elena's pulse quickened. You saw the footage. He nodded firmly. That movement crescent shape, point to the left tap on the chest. It's not gang talk. It's description. He was signing crescent moon, left hand red jacket. Plain and simple. That's what he saw. That's what he said. The words hit Elena like a breath of fresh air after drowning. For days, she had felt truth brushing against her fingertips, but slipping away before she could grasp it. Now at last, here it was solid, undeniable, spoken by someone who could read the silent world Malik lived in. Jonah continued, his expression tightening. What breaks me is how quickly people twist what they don't understand. To them, it's easier to assume threat than innocence. Elena closed her eyes for a moment. She thought of Malik sitting silently under the weight of accusations and of the jury shifting uneasily in their seats. This was the lifeline she needed. The truth had found a voice. When she opened her eyes again, they burned with renewed determination. Jonah, would you be willing to testify, to explain this to the court? He didn't hesitate. If it helps that boy, yes, absolutely. Back inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was unchanged, stern faces, guarded postures, a silent defendant who seemed already condemned in the eyes of too many. But Elena carried with her something new. A pulse of hope. She rose from her seat, smoothed the front of her jacket, and faced Judge Vale with steady composure. Your Honor, she said, I request permission to call an expert interpreter in American Sign Language. He can clarify the meaning of my client's gestures, which the prosecution has wrongly identified as gang signals. Rudd's chair scraped against the floor as he shot up. Your Honor, this is a delay tactic. The defense had every chance to bring interpreters before Judge Vale lifted a hand, her voice sharp. Sit down, Mr. Rudd. I'll allow the witness. The court has an obligation to truth, not convenience. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Even Malik's shoulders lifted slightly, as though the crushing weight had eased just enough for him to breathe. The bailiff opened a side door. Jonah Lee stepped forward, not with the swagger of an expert, but with the quiet dignity of a man carrying something too important to be ignored. Elena watched him take the stand. For the first time all day, her lips curved into the faintest smile. She knew the tide hadn't turned yet, but she could feel it pulling. And in that silent stretch, as Jonah swore his oath and met Malik's eyes across the courtroom, a new story began to take shape. Not one of suspicion, not one of prejudice, but one of understanding spoken in the language of silence. The oath was spoken, the Bible closed, and Jonah Lee adjusted the microphone in front of him. He sat upright, steady, carrying the weight of two languages, the one he lived in and the one Malik was trapped inside. The courtroom grew still. Even Judge Vale leaned slightly forward, sensing that what was about to happen might pierce the heavy silence that had wrapped itself around this case. Jonah turned his body slightly toward Malik, lifting his hands into position. Malik's dark eyes followed him, searching, almost uncertain. Then slowly Malik began to move his fingers. His hands trembled at first, but the meaning was unmistakable. Jonah's voice broke into the stillness. He says, I was afraid. I didn't understand. I just wanted to go home. The words, simple as they were, landed like thunder. The entire room seemed to inhale at once. No one shuffled, no one coughed. Even the reporters' pens froze above their notepads. Malik's chest rose and fell with the effort of speaking through silence. His hands moved again, small and precise. Jonah kept his tone, calm but strong. He says, I never wanted trouble. I never wanted harm. I wanted peace. For the first time since his arrest, Malik's humanity filled the room. No gang signs, no hidden threats, just the raw plea of a young man who had been unheard for far too long. But then a guard near the jury box stiffened. Malik had brushed two fingers quickly across his lips, a sign Jonah knew as fear, confusion, shame. The guard, ignorant and quick to mock, barked out a laugh. Ah, that looks like he's cussing you out. The chuckle caught in a few corners of the gallery, nervous, awkward. But Jonah didn't flinch. He raised his hand firmly like a conductor, halting the wrong note in an orchestra. No, he said, with unshakable clarity. That's not what he said. His voice rang across the benches. That motion means I was ashamed of being misunderstood. He was never insulting anyone. The laughter collapsed into silence. Red crept across the guard's face as he looked away suddenly, very small, in a room that had grown too large for him. Malik, watching all this, lifted his hands again, slower this time. Jonah leaned in, attentive. He says, "All my life I've been told silence was weakness, but it is the only way I knew. I needed someone to hear me." Those words, translated through Jonah, hung in the air like a verdict of their own. For a moment, it was as if everyone could feel what it meant to live behind glass, screaming without sound, until someone finally leaned close enough to listen. Elena rose slowly from her seat. Her eyes swept the room, the jury leaning forward now. Judge Vale's lips pressed tight in thought, and Malik staring down at his own hands, still trembling, still speaking. She let the silence stretch a beat longer, as though inviting the jury to sit with the weight of what they had just witnessed. Then she said, steady but charged with fire. This she motioned toward Malik. Then, Jonah, this is not silence. This is a voice ignored, dismissed, and twisted because it did not sound like ours. Ladies and gentlemen, Malik has been speaking all along. We simply refuse to listen. Her words fell like a stone in still water, rippling outward, breaking through the doubt that had been fed to them by Rudd's sharp tongue and easy accusations. Jonah stayed on the stand, his hands folded. Now his eyes locked on Malik as if to reassure him, "You are not alone anymore. Your voice has been heard." The judge's gavel tapped lightly, but no one moved. No one wanted to. For the first time, the story of this trial wasn't written by the loudest accuser or the coldest authority. It was written by a young black man whose silence had been mistaken for guilt until today, when silence finally found its sound. The moment Jonah stepped down from the stand, Elena rose again. There was something different in her posture, sharper, deliberate, as though she had been holding back a blade until the right moment. She reached for a folder resting on her table, the paper crisp against her hand. Then she walked slowly to the bench, holding up a single sheet. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "This is a printed copy of an email from the prosecutor's own office, dated the morning Malik was first scheduled to appear. It clearly states that the court-appointed interpreter was canceled." The sound of the word "canceled" echoed through the chamber. Reporters leaned forward. Jurors blinked in surprise. Judge Vale lifted his brows. "Is that so?" "Mr. Rudd?" All eyes swung toward the prosecutor. Rudd didn't flinch. He simply shrugged as though brushing away dust. "A clerical error, Your Honor. Nothing more. An administrative oversight." The words carried no weight, but the arrogance behind them filled the room like smoke. Elena tilted her head, her dark hair catching the light. "A clerical error," she repeated softly, letting the phrase linger in the air. She took one step closer to the jury box. "An error so precise that it managed to strip away the single most essential right of this defendant. An error that silenced him before he ever opened his mouth." Her voice grew stronger now, steady as iron. "This is not an error. This is contempt for justice. A calculated choice to turn a young black man's silence into guilt." For the first time, Rudd's lips tightened. He looked down at the table, tapping his pen, but the sound betrayed his unease. Jonah, who had not yet left the courtroom floor, raised his hand. The judge gave a nod. He spoke carefully. "Your Honor, if I may." Without an interpreter, every movement Malik made, every gesture, every attempt to explain was twisted into suspicion. His silence was painted as defiance. His hands were treated as threats. What you see now is the cost of that so-called clerical error. The jury stirred. One woman placed her hand over her mouth, as if realizing for the first time the full weight of what had been denied. And then from the gallery, a trembling voice broke. Layla Malik's mother clutched a handkerchief in both hands. Her shoulders shook as tears fell freely. "He was speaking," she cried out, her voice raw. "He was speaking from the start." But no one would listen. The guard beside her tried to hush her, but Judge Vale raised his hand. "Let her speak." Her words hung in the room, breaking the last fragile thread of doubt. It wasn't anger in her tone, but grief, the kind that made even the hardest hearts falter. Rudd shifted in his seat, pulling at his collar. For the first time, the sharp prosecutor who had commanded the room looked small, cornered by truth he couldn't paper over. Elena placed the email down on the evidence table. She didn't need to say more. The room had already absorbed its meaning. Slowly, like a tide changing course, the atmosphere shifted. The jurors no longer looked at Malik with distance or suspicion. Their eyes softened, some filled with shame, others with a quiet resolve. Even the gallery seemed to lean toward him now, as though the whole room had inched a step closer to his side. And Malik, still silent, still trembling, looked at his mother. For the first time since his arrest, she met his gaze and nodded through her tears. Not because the battle was over, but because at last it felt like the truth had found its way into the light. The courtroom had just begun to settle after Layla's trembling cry when another sound stirred the air. A chair scraped against the wooden floor. Slowly from the very last row of the gallery, a woman stood, tall, poised with a presence that drew every eye without a single word. Her name was Evelyn King. For a heartbeat, no one recognized her beyond the dignified figure she carried. A tailored coat, a calm expression that seemed to mask storms within. But then she spoke, and the sound of her voice sliced through the silence like glass breaking. "I am not here," she began, her words steady as the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. A wave of gasps rippled through the room. The phrase "director of the CIA" landed like thunder. Reporters shot to their feet. Guards turned unsure whether to move or freeze. Even Judge Vale gripped the edge of the bench, his jaw slack. Evelyn did not falter. She let the shock settle before she continued. "I am here as the mother of Malik Johnson." The entire courtroom seemed to stop breathing. Malik's head jerked toward her. His wide, bewildered eyes filled with tears he had fought so long to contain. His lips parted, but no sound came. His hands trembled against the table, every muscle straining as if to reach for her, but too paralyzed by disbelief. For the first time, the boy who had carried silence like a shield looked utterly broken open by a truth he had not expected. The gallery erupted. Some voices shouted in disbelief, others whispered frantically. The CIA director, his mother, cameras clicked furiously. Security guards braced their radios, buzzing with urgent chatter. But Evelyn raised her hand and the room obeyed. It wasn't just authority, it was something deeper. The kind of command that comes from a life lived under constant fire. Her gaze swept across the jurors, the judge, the prosecutor, then finally returned to her son. "I never wanted this revealed," she said, her voice softening now. "For years I kept it hidden. I let him grow up without the weight of my name, without the enemies that come with it. I thought silence was protection." She paused, her eyes glistening, though her composure never cracked. "But now my silence is his noose, and I will not let my son be condemned because I chose to keep him safe from my world." Malik shook his head slowly, as though still trying to comprehend. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. He whispered so faint only those closest could hear, "Mom." It was not the voice of a man accused or even of a soldier in restraint. It was the voice of a son stripped of everything but the raw ache of recognition. Evelyn stepped forward. The guards at the aisle hesitated, but Judge Vale motioned them aside, his own face pale and unreadable. "I am standing here not as an official," she continued, "but as a mother who has watched her child stripped of dignity, denied his voice, and framed for crimes he did not commit. And I can no longer remain silent." Every word struck like a hammer. You could feel the jury shifting in their seats, could see doubt unraveling the prosecutor's carefully woven net. Rudd tried to recover, his voice breaking into the chaos. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This is nothing but a desperate ploy, an appeal to sympathy. Her position is irrelevant to the facts of this case." But Evelyn turned to him, and for the first time the prosecutor looked like prey under the gaze of a predator. "Irrelevant," she said quietly. "It was your office that silenced my son. Your office that erased his right to speak. And now you call a mother's truth irrelevant." The crowd murmured, their voices rising again. The air in the courtroom had shifted, the balance of power tipping in a way no one could ignore. Evelyn returned her focus to the bench. "Judge Vale, you can punish me for speaking out of turn. You can cite me for contempt. But do not ask me to sit down when my son's life is being broken in front of me." Her words cracked then, just barely. But it was enough. Enough to remind everyone in that room that beneath the title, beneath the steel, she was simply a mother. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged electric, the kind of silence that makes people realize they are standing on the edge of something historic. Malik, still trembling, lowered his face into his hands. And though he had said nothing, his tears spoke louder than any defense could have. At that moment, the trial was no longer just about evidence or legal maneuvering. It was about a truth that had been hidden for too long, and a mother who refused to let her silence bury her son alive. The room hadn't recovered from Evelyn's reveal when she lifted her chin toward the bench. "Your Honor," she said, measured but fierce, "I request permission for the interpreter to retranslate the entire video, gesture by gesture. My son deserves to be heard. This court deserves the truth." Judge Harriet Vale glanced at the screen, then at Malik. "A beat. Granted. Proceed." Travis Rudd rose too quickly. "Objection, unduly cumulative, Your Honor." Overruled, Vale said, not raising her voice. "Let us make a clear record." Jonah Lee stepped to the monitor. His hands hovered a moment as if asking the room to listen. He tapped the keyboard. The traffic cam footage filled the screen. The image caught Malik in profile red jacket, bright even through grain. "Slow playback," Jonah said. "Here." He traced the first motion with his own hand. "Crescent, he's describing a curve, not a signal." Then he points left direction of travel. "Now watch, he taps the chest of the jacket color garment. He is not summoning anyone. He is identifying what he saw." A rustle moved through the gallery. The jurors leaned in elbows near the rail. Jonah froze the frame again. "This next part matters." Malik angles his wrist, left hand dominant. "That is a specific descriptor. Officers wrote gang sign. It is not. It is left-handed." He let the words sit. Elena stood beside him. "Your Honor, Defense Exhibit G." She lifted a photocopy. "From the police report and release log 3 days before Malik's arrest. Unknown male redcoat left-handed, release pending follow-up, insufficient cause." The state had this and pressed forward anyway. Rudd's jaw set. "That document is hearsay without "It's your office's log," Mr. Rudd," Elena said. "You can authenticate it during your turn." On the screen, Malik's hands moved again in jerky, frightened rhythm. Jonah narrated softly the way you might read a letter someone wrote in a storm. "He signed scar right here above the eye." Jonah touched his own brow. "Then ran east, and I was afraid." He is not confessing. He is witnessing. Judge Vale's eyes flicked to Malik, then back to the glowing frame. The clerk stopped writing to watch. From the second row, Layla whispered, "That's how he signs Moon," and pressed a fist to her mouth. She wasn't making a scene. She was remembering a kitchen table, a boy drawing the night with his hands. Jonah advanced to the last sequence. The room seemed to tilt toward him. Final segment. Malik's shoulders were shaking in the video. His fingers tried to keep shape. He signs, "I don't understand. I'm scared. I want to go home." Jonah swallowed, then repeated steady, "Not a confession, a plea." A few heads bowed. Someone in the back murmured, "God help him." Elena didn't sermonize. She kept to bone in truth. What we just heard is language. What we just saw is testimony. When an interpreter was canceled, that testimony was turned into guilt. Rudd scraped his chair back, found no purchase. "Your Honor, the people contend the officers." "The officers misread a child in crisis," Elena said, not unkindly. "That is human. Persisting in the misread after seeing this, after knowing this, would be something else." Silence gathered in the seams of the room, not empty but charged. Vale drummed one finger once on the wood, a habit more than a warning. Jonah closed his hands as if folding a fragile thing back into safety. "With respect, Your Honor, this is the cost of proceeding without access." Every gesture was bent to fit a story it did not mean to tell. Evelyn remained standing, eyes clear. "Fear was mistaken for admission," she said quietly, "and silence was mistaken for guilt." The bailiff glanced at Vale. The judge gave a small nod. "The court accepts the interpreter's explanation for the limited purpose of understanding the video." She paused, then added, "It is compelling." A low wave of sound rolled across the benches. It wasn't chaos. It was people remembering how to breathe. Rudd tried one last tack. "Even if the signs are descriptive, the defendant wore a red jacket. He matched the scene." Jonah didn't look at him. "So did the released suspect," he said. "The difference, Mr. Rudd, is that Malik was trying to help." All at once, the posture of the room changed. Jurors uncrossed their arms. A reporter stopped writing and simply watched Malik. In the well, Elena exhaled for the first time in hours. On the screen, the frozen image of the boy in red held steady hands, mid-motion, a sentence the world had finally learned to read. Malik blinked hard at the table, then lifted his fingers an inch, unsure a question. Jonah met his eyes and nodded once. Yes, they heard you. The judge tapped her gavel lightly. Order. It wasn't a scold, it was punctuation. For months, the story had been simple: a red coat, a refusal, an easy villain. In 5 minutes of careful translation, that story cracked. You could feel it like a door long swollen shut coming free in its frame. Rudd stared at the exhibit copy on Elena's table and found nothing to say. The room did not cheer. It didn't need to. The louder thing was quieter, the sense that a boy's truth had finally been put in the record, and that whatever came next would have to answer to it. The courtroom was heavy with silence. For a long while, Judge Vale said nothing. His fingers tapped slowly against the bench as though weighing the weight of history itself. The gavel that once struck so confidently now seemed too heavy to lift. People shifted uneasily in their seats, every breath in that room, waiting for what the judge would finally say. And then his voice came low but clear. The court has failed, he admitted, each word falling like stone. We failed to guarantee the most basic right of the defendant to be heard. For that, this court bears responsibility. The crowd gasped. No one had expected those words from Vale, a man known for his stubborn pride. Even the reporters dropped their pens for a moment, staring in disbelief. You could almost feel the air thicken, as if the walls themselves had paused to listen. At the defense table, Malik's eyes glistened. His hands trembled as he lifted them, slowly forming signs with deliberate care. Jonah leaned forward, his voice steady as he translated. I wasn't silent, I just wasn't heard. The words rippled through the courtroom like thunder. Some held their breath, others covered their mouths. It was not a shout, not an accusation. It was simply the truth, quiet, undeniable, and heavier than any verdict. Evelyn's composure broke. The woman who had faced down senators, who had carried the weight of national secrets, was now only a mother. Tears streamed down her face as she rose from her seat. She crossed the courtroom in slow, unsteady steps, then reached out and took her son's hand in both of hers. Her voice shook. Malik, I should have never let you stand alone. Malik turned his eyes toward her. He signed again, and Jonah's voice cracked as he repeated it aloud. You never let me stand alone. You're here now. That was all it took. Evelyn collapsed into his embrace, her forehead pressing against his shoulder as sobs escaped her chest. The years of secrecy, the heavy armor she wore for so long, all of it crumbled in that instant. From the gallery, Layla couldn't stay in her seat. She ran forward before anyone could stop her tears streaking her young face. Malik, she cried, throwing her arms around both mother and son. Her small frame shook, but her hold was fierce, as if she could shield them from every injustice in the world. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene, but Judge Vale raised a hand. For once, his sternness softened. Let them be, he said quietly. The courtroom fell into absolute stillness. Every person present, lawyers, officers, strangers, watched the three figures locked together in the center. Even the clicking of cameras seemed to falter, as if reporters knew some moments were too sacred to disturb. What lingered most wasn't the judge's confession, nor the mother's tears. It was Malik's words that weren't spoken at all but cut deeper than any argument. I wasn't silent, I just wasn't heard. For the first time since the trial began, the jury shifted toward him with empathy instead of suspicion. For the first time, the public saw not a defendant, not a case number, but a young man whose voice had been stolen by negligence and indifference. You could see people exchange looks, wiping their eyes, their hardened expressions softening. Some shook their heads, ashamed at how long it had taken to realize what was in front of them all along. Elena, the defense attorney, stood quietly in the corner. She had fought for weeks, but even she knew this moment spoke louder than any cross-examination. Justice had a human face now, and it was Malik's. Vale cleared his throat, his voice betraying a rare quiver. This trial will not continue under the shadow of silence. The defendant will be granted full and fair hearing with every word, every gesture properly translated and recorded. This court cannot erase its mistake, but it will not compound it. But the judge's words were almost background now, because no decree could rival the weight of Malik's truth. As the gavel finally came down, not in judgment but in pause, the room remained suspended in awe. You could almost hear hearts beating, the kind of silence that follows revelation, not empty but full. And in that silence, everyone knew this case was no longer about evidence alone. It was about a voice long ignored, finally breaking through the walls of indifference. The boy they had dismissed, mocked, misrepresented, he had spoken, and the world at last had listened. The courtroom had never been so silent. Judge Vale adjusted his glasses, his face heavy, almost burdened by the weight of what he was about to say. His voice came low at first, then steadier. This court suspends the life sentence of Malik Johnson. The case will be reopened. A warrant is hereby issued for the arrest of the suspect previously released, male left-handed, last seen in a red jacket. Gasps rippled through the benches. Lawyers whispered. Reporters scribbled as if their pens could barely keep up. Then Vale went further. The mishandling of interpretation in this courtroom, the very tool meant to give Mr. Johnson a voice, is hereby referred to an independent commission. This court must never again fail to listen. Jonah's head bowed, tears welling. Elena pressed a hand to her chest, whispering to herself. He fought every second. He never gave up. Malik stood motionless for a beat, his chains of fear finally broken. Evelyn brushed a tear from her cheek, her voice low but steady as she leaned toward him. You see, son, you never were silent. You were fighting in your own way all along. Jonah signed her words into Malik's hands. Malik nodded, his eyes brimming. His lips parted in slow movement, not for the court, not for the cameras, but for himself. The moment stretched into eternity before the gavel struck. It was over. Malik was free, and yet it felt like the beginning of something greater. Outside, the sun sat high, scattering golden light across the courthouse steps. Malik stepped out, flanked by Evelyn and Layla, reporters, swarming with questions that flew like arrows. Director King, was this a political move? Madame, what does this mean for national security? Do you fear retaliation from your enemies? Evelyn raised her hand, gently silencing the storm. She looked not like the formidable CIA director they knew, but simply a mother with lines of exhaustion and pride written across her face. Today, she said firmly, I am not here as director of the CIA. I am here as a mother who refused to let her son's voice vanish in silence. Her words carried through the crowd, as though the wind itself paused to carry them farther. On the steps, Malik paused, letting the warmth of the midday sun wash over his face. He couldn't hear the clamor of questions, nor the clicking of cameras, nor the chant of voices shouting his name. But in that silence, he heard something louder than sound, the thrum of his own heartbeat, steady and free. Layla slipped her hand into his, whispering, through tears, you're not alone anymore. He smiled, small, quiet, but radiant. As the doors of the courthouse closed behind them, a single truth lingered unspoken. Yet undeniable justice is only real when society learns to listen to its faintest voices. And that brings us to the end of today's story. What we just heard isn't only about Malik's struggle, it's about justice, resilience, and the power of listening to those who are too often ignored. Stories like this remind us that dignity, fairness, and compassion are the foundations of a better world. If this story moved you, I'd love for you to hit the like button, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Max Stories for more powerful, thought-provoking stories just like this one. Your support means the world to us. Every click, every share, and every subscription gives our team the motivation to keep creating meaningful content that uplifts and inspires. And remember, here at Mr. Max Stories, we don't just tell stories, we shine a light on truth, justice, and the human spirit.